All right, so we're going to talk today about using standardized diagnostic terminology for nutrition diagnosis. So I want you to think a little bit about whether or not you've adopted the use of international dietetics and nutrition terminology in your practice. And if you are and have, how are you currently incorporating the documentation format that is inherent in using that terminology, called the problem, etiology, and signs and symptoms statement, in your charting for pediatric patients? So of course this particular format can be inserted into any chart note, but think about how you might be using it now or would like to use it. What is the benefit of incorporating international dietetics and nutrition terminology and the partner format in the PES statement into the documentation? And is adoption of IDNT and PES changing the way you assess and treat patients? So those are the things that I want you to think about, whether or not they're happening now, or potentially, based on our discussion today, you might actually start doing that in your practice. So if you think about what the nutrition diagnosis is, and again, this is again open for discussion, so please don't let me just rattle on here for 20 minutes and not throw in your 2 cents worth. The nutrition diagnosis is a specific nutrition problem, and we are identifying and naming it using terminology that all of us are supposed to understand. And those of you who've been practicing as long as I have know that we were trained to write things in very flowery language and lots of descriptors, and our notes were really long, and sometimes they were the longest notes in the chart. The issue with that sometimes is it wasn't clear to the folks that we were trying to communicate to on our healthcare team what it was we were actually concerned about with the patient and what exactly we were going to work on in that immediate time that we had to work with a patient, either inpatient or outpatient. So that's what the nutrition diagnosis is supposed to do for us. It's supposed to be a very specific nutrition problem, and it relates very specifically to the nutrition assessment. This diagnosis is the missing link between the assessment and the intervention. And if we are using very specific terminology, then it describes the specific nutrition problem that the nutrition professional is responsible for treating independently. So it's not the same thing as a medical diagnosis, which is an ICD-9 or ICD-10 code. Those are sometimes used to refer patients to us so that we know what issues potentially we'd be billing under on an encounter form, but it's not specifically something that we are going to treat. In other words, we can manage diabetes, but we aren't going to make it go away. So what part of it, when we label a nutrition problem, are we responsible for treating independently and should be responsible for? So there are 3 general domains, and I hope all of you, if you don't have it already, have bought your 4th edition of the Pocket Guide or the larger version of the terminology. And it's a fairly dense tome. It's about 300 pages, and the writing is less than 12 font, so you might need your glasses. And there's lots of information in there. But there are 3 general domains. One is the intake, and that has to do with excessive or inadequate intake compared to requirements that are either actual or estimated. And this is the realm where nutrition professionals are the best suited to manage issues and problems. Clinical relates to medical or physical conditions that are outside, again, that actual or that normal or typical when compared to those standards in an assessment. And the last domain, behavioral and environmental, relates to knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, physical environment, access to food or food safety. So it's a much broader group of considerations when we have to look at potential problems that we'd be labeling. So here's a picture, latest edition of the International Dietetics and Nutrition Terminology Reference Manual. This is the 4th edition. Seems like every couple of years we've been getting a new version. The one about this particular version is that it incorporates now all terminology for not only assessment, diagnosis, and intervention, as well as monitoring and evaluation. So it includes terminology for all 4 parts of the nutrition care process. What we're going to talk about today is very specifically the diagnostic part, because if one was to start somewhere, that's the place that we need the most standardization. And the reason for that is clear when we're trying to communicate to others in the medical record what it is that we're trying to do for the patient we're tasked with caring for. So that communication is very, very specific when using this terminology. And the format for communicating that diagnosis is the PES statement. So the problem is the diagnostic label pulled from standard terminology, and it describes very succinctly the alterations or the issues related to a client's nutritional status. The etiology is the cause or contributing risk factor. And one of the things that we really have to be careful to do, and when I work with students, this is one of the things that comes up all the time, we have to work to describe the root cause. Because a lot of times there are multiple causes. If you can think of all the things that you do in your life, usually the thing that you're trying to fix is, whether it's trying to get all the laundry done by Sunday night, or make sure all the kids' homework is done before 8 o'clock at night. There are all kinds of causes for why that doesn't happen. So the idea is to try, as much as you can, get down to the root cause, because that likely will give you the biggest bang for your buck and get you closer to dealing with that problem. And then the signs or symptoms are the defining characteristics that actually come from the nutrition assessment. And they also can be used to monitor nutrition intervention. So if you're looking at a problem, and we have some examples for you today, so a problem, and you've decided that there's a root cause that you can articulate here, then those signs and symptoms are the things that are actual quantitative, measurable outcomes. That if you do something to that root cause, that problem will get better because you can monitor those signs and symptoms. And I think it's a fabulous way to actually teach assessment and diagnostics, because it's so formulaic in the way it's charted. But it's hard for those of us who've been doing it differently for 20-some years. All the terms in the book can or must be used as the problem in the diagnostic terminology. And the associated numbers in the book aren't required. However, I noticed here there's a typo. It says her. Every time you try to type in EHR, electronic health record, the computer thinks it wants to change it to something else. So that's actually EHR. As we move to more global use of electronic health records, those numbers will be like the ICD-9 codes. They'll be searchable in fields, so that you don't necessarily have to memorize those things, but after a while, probably you will, the ones that you use a lot. But at this point, when you're actually writing those things out, you don't need to include the numbers. But eventually, if you're on an EHR, you'll probably have those in your searchable fields. Some of these terms can also be used as signs and symptoms as long as they're accompanied by actual data. In other words, the actual quantitative thing that you're going to measure in terms of change. One thing to keep in mind is that when we do a nutrition assessment, and we've talked about that before, the ABCs of nutrition assessment, and in children, we go all the way to G. So A is anthropometrics, B is biochemical, C is clinical, D is dietary, E is environmental, F is functional, or in this case, developmental, so where are they developmentally, and G is growth. So we're looking at growth patterns. So those are the ABCs of nutrition assessment in the pediatric sense. We have to have a nutrition assessment data that supports our diagnosis. In other words, if you can't tie something very specific that you've noted in your assessment to your nutrition diagnosis, you're probably looking at a diagnosis that's not as clear as you want it to be. It must be specific enough to be able to show improvement when an intervention is started. So in other words, it's going to direct your intervention because it's tied to your assessment. And that nutrition assessment data is going to be used as a sign and symptom to clearly show that a given problem and why a given problem and etiology were selected, but also to monitor outcomes when you're following up after your intervention. So the way we document this is that we actually put the problem on that first line, which is the diagnostic label, and it's related to that root cause as evidenced by these very specific things or these signs and symptoms. And this is not different from other clinical providers who use similar kinds of very structured kinds of charting. Nurses have a very structured kind of charting. Physicians do, but not so much this. It pretty much depends on where you're practicing and what your particular hospital likes to use. But one of the things that the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and our group of providers is trying to do is make sure that if I use a nutrition diagnostic label here in New Mexico, that someone in Ohio, if that child gets transferred there, knows what I'm talking about when they read my note. And that's been one of the things that's always been an issue as you dig through some of the qualitative and quantitative data that gets communicated in the medical record by all different kinds of providers. Is that sometimes we misunderstand each other unless we're standing right in front of one another on rounds and talking about a patient. So trying to clarify as much as possible what it is that we're actually concerned about and what it is that we're actually working on. It also clearly defines our scope of practice so that it's clear that when we're working on a multidisciplinary care team, this is the piece that we're going to contribute to this child's care. We're not going to be working in somebody else's area. Now, it doesn't mean that those things don't overlap, but it means we have a very, very specific space that we're going to be trying to improve. So what I've got for you today are some practice case studies, and in the handouts that were associated with the discussion today, there was a one-page diagnostic terminology guide that you can use. Now that was from the 3rd edition because I'm not quite sure how many of you have the 4th edition, so I've got the 4th edition in front of me, but that one's one that you can use. So what I would like us to do is spend a little time this morning just practicing, because again, you can read this whole book. Like I said, it's 300 pages, but one of the things that I think you all should know is that if you look nationally, adoption of use of standardized terminology by members of the Academy is at about 50%, and full adoption was supposed to occur this year. So in other words, the Academy's plan was that all of us would be doing this in every place we practiced, all the time, by 2013. The first of these diagnostic codes were released in 2005, so there we go. That's a number of years that people are still struggling with how to use this in your practice, which is why we get to talk about it today. And certainly in pediatrics, there's always this concern as how do standard terms actually fit in the pediatric population. So I think that's why it's a good idea for us to practice. Now, before we start on this case, is there anyone who signed on that didn't announce themselves when we did our first roll call?
Yes, this is Nancy Eitler from Pine Ridge IHS.
Morning, Nancy.
Good morning.
Is there anyone else? Okay, so if we go through this case, this child is an 11-year-old, 8-month male. He has a history of peanut allergy. He was diagnosed before the age of 7. This child was referred to us, the nutrition providers, for decreasing growth velocity. His weight is 34.9 kilograms, which puts him at the 28th percentile for his age. His height is 146.8 centimeters at the 49th percentile. BMI 16.2, which puts him at the 24th percentile. And his BMI for his BMI at age 8. So he's 11 years, 8 months now, just over 11 and a half years, but at age 8 his BMI was 16.6 and put him at the 67th percentile. So that's what you've got from the standpoint of very concrete anthropometric measures and a little bit of medical history. This child refuses family meals. He makes his own. The child has concerns that he's not fit and that he might have an allergic reaction. His mother reports that he is restricting intake beyond allergy control, so that's what she's concerned about. In a brief 24-hour recall, that history revealed about 1,600 kilocalories of intake and 66 grams of protein, but he consumes as part of his 24-hour recall 8 ounces of Ensure a day. You estimate his needs to be around 2,300 calories and 33 grams of protein. So that's where we're starting from. So if you were to take that format that I showed you before and use the list of codes, what would you choose as a diagnostic label using standardized terminology? Now keep in mind that most cases have more than one diagnosis. And this is where we sometimes get into trouble because we want to try to solve all the problems of the world all at once. And one of the things that comes up when I work with students is that they try to put all the problems in one PES statement. It's okay to have multiple problems, multiple PES statements, and they potentially might have the same etiology and they might not, and they might have the same signs and symptoms as they might and they might not, but you don't have to clump them all together. Because one of the things when I work with students that I really want to get across is that you might have multiple problems, but which one are you going to choose today to work on? You can't do all of them usually at once. And again, this is one of the things in the past, and I look at my own practice with a great deal of reflection, the long notes where I listed all these things and all the things that I was going to do. But your plan really for the day is, of these things that are going on, this is the one that's the most important and the one I'm going to be able to fix first. So that's the one I'm going to start with. Okay? Doesn't mean I'm not going to get a chance to follow up, because any good care will involve some kind of follow-up. So take a stab at this one and see what you get. I'm going to put the case back up. So again, we're trying to write a PES statement for this child who's about 11 and a half years old with a peanut allergy. And this is when I stop talking and you talk. This is when we need that Jeopardy music, right? Or some other kind of thing. Kevin, be the musician.
Play the drums, Kevin.
Yeah. Anybody want to take a stab? And this is not a test, right? We are all individual practitioners with individual skill sets, and this is practice. This is why we're doing it here. Because one of the things that I find in working with people who are my own age, who have been doing this for a long time, is the medical record in the hospital or clinic where you're working is sort of a bad place to practice if you're all by yourself. It's what we would call a high-stakes environment. So the opportunity here to play around with a case and practice using this when it's a safe place where you've got other people who can give you feedback, I think is really, really important. So don't be afraid. The other thing is, one of the things you probably remember, all of you, from your training is, just because I label it one way doesn't mean you can't label it another way. It doesn't make it wrong. We're approaching this from the standpoint of our experience. The idea here is just to practice using standardized terminology. So, that being said, anybody want to try? I'm going to give you a hint. Try to stay in the intake domain. It makes it a whole lot easier. Even though there might be issues that you're concerned about with clinical and issues that you're concerned about with behavioral and environmental, the intake domain is where we are the experts compared to everybody else on the healthcare team. So try to stay in the intake domain if you can. Again, this is what I try to get students to focus on. That's what we're best at. That's why you took all those food science classes.
The one that I would choose would be inadequate energy intake. And this is Mildred.
Hi, Mildred. All right, what's
Hi.
the rest of your statement? What's your E and your S?
The problem would be that he's sufficient carbohydrate, or no, it's not carbohydrate. Decrease ability to consume sufficient energy, self-restricting, because he knows he's allergic to peanuts, so he's avoiding that, so I don't think that's the issue. Signs and symptoms is going to be his calorie levels are below the estimated needs.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So you have I did similar kind of thing. I love that inadequate energy intake because it's very specific to energy, but you could also, in that same thing, if you had signs and symptoms that were related to a macronutrient profile of what if you've done an analysis, you could include fat and carbohydrate and protein in there also. So I think that's good. The other thing that you've pulled out is the etiology you think is related to that he's concerned and he's self-restricting, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it may mean that there's some behavioral stuff that potentially would be part of your therapy. So, I think that's important. I think you've picked up on a really, really important piece. And I like that you didn't pick malnutrition because that one's out there and it can be used. The problem is, and it goes sort of back and forth. I think it was last spring we talked about an article that came out from Aspen, the American Society for Parental and Enteral Nutrition, and if I remember, we'll talk about that article again, where malnutrition was defined. And one of the things that we try to do is keep ourselves from using that particular label because it's so broad. Because malnutrition isn't just inadequate intake, or it could also be excessive intake, or inconsistent intake, or altered intake. So it's nice to be able to label it. So I like what you came up with. Anybody else have a different one? So someone could also choose, if you look down at the second portion, the oral or nutrition support intake, limited food acceptance is another one that could be used. And again, it would be related to this report of concern that he might have an allergic reaction and his mother's report of restriction beyond what she thinks is allergy control. Again, it can be evidenced by the fact that his energy needs are less than what we have estimated, but also that he refuses his family meals and makes his own. So one of the things that you might be measuring, and this is a little softer, is that if he starts eating what's made for the family, that might be evidence of a change. Again, this one is focusing potentially on some behavioral therapy. The other thing that we could have put in here for his signs and symptoms, that you could include sort of in a laundry list of signs and symptoms, are the changes in his growth. That his BMI percentiles have changed from the 67th percentile at age 8 to where he is now at the 24th percentile. And that's kind of a funny thing for us to consider, because a lot of times we talk about kids being too heavy. And if you just saw one point in time 24th percentile for a BMI, we might not be concerned about that because that's considered within the range of acceptable or healthy BMI. Given the rest of this story, though, it makes us concerned that maybe what we're seeing in his estimated needs and his intake is not sufficient. Good job, everybody. All right, second case. So this is a 30-month-old Hispanic male. He has a history of developmental delay, failure to thrive, and gastroesophageal reflux disease, constipation, and feeding difficulties. He receives early intervention services. His weight is 10.4 kilograms, puts him at lower or less than the first percentile, and his height is 90 centimeters at the 90th percentile. So if you saw this child, he'd be tall and skinny. He eats pureed table food and takes Pediasure by bottle. His current intake from Pediasure provides more than 75% of his micronutrient needs and 70% of his estimated calorie and protein needs. The pureed food provides 10% of estimated macronutrient needs. He has no other liquid than Pediasure that's consumed during the day. Okay, so again, our exercise. We're going to try to construct a PES statement or statements based on this particular case. So let's have a go at this one. Anybody want to try? All right, so this is a little harder. So I'll take a stab at it. And again, remember, these things are not right or wrong. What I'm really trying to get you guys to think about is what diagnostic terminology you would use. The other thing that's really cool about this is that you can actually use other diagnostic terms for the etiology also. So, an example of how we might use the same terms that we used before, we could say inadequate energy intake, evidenced by approximately 70 to 80% of estimated needs being consumed between Pediasure and pureed foods. Okay, that's related to, as evidenced by the weight at less than the first percentile. Okay, another one would be inadequate fluid intake as your problem. Related to no other liquid being consumed but Pediasure. As evidenced by constipation. Okay, and then part of an assessment that you could do here that is not included in what I gave you is you could calculate this child's fluid needs based on his age and weight and height, and then include that in your signs and symptoms, so that you're going to be looking at a change in fluid intake compared to the Pediasure, which I didn't do for you here, and the constipation as being a sign and symptom. Okay, and that would be a common picture for someone who has feeding issues and a history of reflux disease and developmental delay. Anybody else come up with any different ones? You could also use something like inadequate vitamin intake or inadequate mineral intake, because I told you that Pediasure only provides about 75%. You could use the multi-nutrient one. We're still in the intake domain that says predicted suboptimal nutrient intake, which is 5.1.1.1, because again, the combination of those two things, given the fact that he's just taking Pediasure and some unnamed pureed foods, make us concerned that if we predict his nutrient intake would be less than we expect. Again, it's related to the fact that he's consuming just Pediasure and some pureed foods, and it's evidenced for the signs and symptoms of the change or the growth pattern that makes us concerned. I've either stunned you all into silence or I've bored you to tears. This is hard stuff. That's why we get to talk about it here, because it's a safe place to talk about it. Okay, case number 3. This is an 8-month-old female, and she gets breast milk in a bottle at daycare. She nurses twice a day, morning and the evening when her mom's available. All her growth parameters are consistently between the 50th and 75th percentile. She sits unsupported, and she's beginning to crawl, and she will eat some finger food. So Samantha is fussy when her mom picks her up from daycare and she wants to be held. She has a 3-year-old sister who's also in the same daycare setting, who's hungry and wants to eat immediately, so mom prepares dinner. Samantha refuses solid food at this time and dislikes the high chair. Mom thinks this child is hungry and would be less irritable if she ate dinner. And you guys know you've seen a kid just like this before, plus the other two that I presented as cases. So how about this one? What would you guys come up with? Anybody have a place they would start? Okay, so she's developmentally where we would expect her to be. She's growing reasonably. This is a sort of a tricky question. This is really all about mom. Okay? This is one of these situations where there really isn't a nutrition problem. I had to throw you a curveball, right? It's Friday morning at 8 o'clock. And I think sometimes we see this. This is a child who's eating some finger food. She's growing like we would expect. She's still nursing, and she gets breast milk as her primary feeding, which is still what we'd expect at 8 months. We don't know about what her solid food intake is, but we're assuming that mom knows what she's doing and that what she started is appropriate to meet her needs. But this is about mom. This child is fussy. She's fussy when mom picks her up. Why is she fussy? She wants to be held. She misses mom. She wants to nurse. Mom's been at work all day. She's 8 months old. She's at that point where these people are not my people. I want my people. The 3-year-old sister, however, is hungry. It's dinner time. She wants to eat, so mom's responding really appropriately to that 3-year-old. Man, I need to eat. But Samantha doesn't want to sit in the high chair at that time, and so she's not eating. So mom thinks the child is hungry and would be less irritable if she ate dinner. Okay? Not that that might not be true, so one of the places to start here is addressing what's going on with mom. Okay, so this is one of these things where you actually then go to out of the intake domain and you go into the behavioral and environmental part of what's going on here. And you could write something here, but really this is about what's going on with mom. So anybody want to take a stab at using potentially the behavioral environmental nutrition diagnoses here? I've really pushed you over the edge now, huh? So limited food acceptance you could actually use as a diagnosis, but again, remember this is not so much about the child, about mom. And you could use the knowledge and belief section. So limited food acceptance related to food and nutrition related knowledge deficit on the part of mom is evidenced by misinterpretation of the feeding cues, or the parenting cue, or the needs for cuddling cues that the child is sending. But you could also say no nutrition diagnosis at this time. Okay, case 4. This is a 7-year-old male, Timothy. His BMI is 20. It's greater than the 95th percentile. Do you see that, Kevin?
It appears we've lost our connection to the webinar, and we need to get that back. Is anyone still on audio?
Yeah, I'm here, Kirsten.
Okay, so I'll just keep talking because you guys have your handouts.
Okay.
So in this 7-year-old whose BMI is at 20, at greater than the 95th percentile, his height's between the 75th and 90th. His weight is at the 95th percentile for his age. He watches a lot of TV after school with the babysitter or plays video games. He has high-calorie snack foods available after school. He's in 2nd grade. So that's what we know about him. His mom is obese and dad is normal weight. Dinner is prepared at home and, has a nice mix of, protein and vegetables, starch and dessert. And then he has ice cream snack before his bed time with a TV show. So he snacks in front of the TV at dinner. So anybody want to make an attempt here at using or constructing a PES statement for this child? Now this is all about your practice, not about my practice. And remember, there's not a right or wrong. It's just practice. Okay, Kirsten Watts, I heard you're on.
I knew you were going to ask.
You're in the spotlight now because you get to do this every day with a whole variety of patients. Many of them look just like the cases that we talked about today.
Yeah, true. So I'll have a go at it. I would probably do undesirable food choices as my main PES related to, I would say, just the availability of low-quality nutritional foods. as evidenced by BMI greater than the 95th percentile and daily consumption of high-calorie, low nutritional quality snacks. Something like that.
Okay. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. And so if you were going to have an intervention, how would you expect those signs and symptoms to change?
Well, probably for a kid this age, I would just want weight maintenance at this point.
Okay.
And then
So
as far
okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as far as food choices, I would expect, a change in what's offered after school and before bedtime. So, like fruits and vegetables and hummus and that kind of stuff instead of high-calorie snacks and ice cream.
Okay. So one of the things that you want to do is, so you mentioned when I said, what would you monitor? And you said your weight and height. Make sure if you want to monitor that you put that in your signs and symptoms.
Right, yeah. So I said a BMI greater than the 95th percentile.
Okay.
So,
okay. Sorry, I didn't hear that.
And then, yeah, sorry. It was a long one. I felt it's hard to just say them out loud compared to writing them down for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, one is kind of clunky because, you weren't necessarily taught this either. You're younger than I am, but, we still are just struggling with how we introduce this to new dietetic professionals in a way that makes it easier for them to learn. It's harder for those of us who've been out there practicing because we have these other habits. So another one that you could potentially use is predicted excessive nutrient intake or energy intake, because you are assuming, we're making an assumption that these high-calorie snack foods after school, the ice cream before bed, and the lack of physical activity or decreased physical activity is contributing to this weight that we consider undesirable. So even though I don't have, calorie intake here for you on this case, we could predict that it's probably more than this child needs, so that's why you can use that term also. So I think one of the things that I could share with you all as you're learning to use these terms is that when you get a case, you don't always have everything you want. So we have to work with what's available, and we could figure out, based on a diet history, we could estimate what we think somebody's getting, and we can also estimate what they need. But sometimes just looking at what we've got available and constructing something is a good place to start. So in other words, we're doing an assessment based on the available information. Not that we wouldn't want anything else, but we're going to try to work with what we've got. And so we certainly have enough in there that we could get started. And Kirsten, I think this is one of the things that we've talked about on the phone. When you're in a really busy practice, that might be a really good strategy for a case like this one where you don't have everything you want, but you have enough that you think you could get something started with the family and have your visit be a very focused or problem-focused visit. And then with the things that I'd want to know in this case, I'd probably want to know exactly what the child's eating, what the meals look like, what the snacks look like. I could ask them to keep track of that for 3 days and bring it back to me the next time. And then at that point, I could do an estimated calorie intake based on their records and also estimate what I think this child needs. So that might be a strategy for trying to use what we have in a really short period of time. And I know you're struggling with that now as you are in a practice that's really, really busy.
Yeah, I'm learning how to deal with that. I actually just had a patient yesterday who, by the end, we just had to agree that they needed to come back with a food diary in a month. So it does work, though, because you can give them at least one suggestion to start with, and then they get more motivated. And the more often you see them, I feel like I'm actually having better results than when I was able to do really intense interventions all at one time with people.
That's right. It's good. Those QI folks in the room here are raising their pom-poms to you. Yes, one little step at a time. Don't try to do it all at once. Keep them engaged. Yeah, so that's a strategy. So hopefully those cases have helped you a little bit with that. So do any of you have any questions or comments about what we've talked about? And what would complete adoption of use of international dietetics and nutrition terminology and the accompanying standardized format in the PES statement look like in your practice if you were to actually do that? Anybody have any comments? Questions? Anybody sign on in the that we didn't acknowledge?
This is Rupa from Warm Springs, Oregon. I just signed on, so I kind of missed. I came towards the end.
Oh, okay, sorry, Rupa. I had to change it today. I have to be somewhere else earlier than usual, so we had to start at 8 today.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
So
is there any way, maybe, just like the case studies that you guys talked about, if I could have like a little, like an answer thing just to follow? So I know there's no right or wrong, but just to have a little bit more practice, because I have not been using it here and at WIC, and so, but I would like to learn a little bit more to practice. I did go to a course, but I still need to work on it better.
Okay. Yeah, I could put together something like that, and we can put it up for you to look at.
Sure, we can do that. We'll also have the video of this session available, hopefully within a week.
Oh, okay, great. So if I missed it, I can rewatch it.
Right.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah, I can do that. And I think, Rupa, you bring up a really good point, is that most of us who've been practicing for a while who weren't exposed to this during our initial training, the way that we're expected to figure this out is to go to one of those courses. You know, we go to a big conference and you have somebody talk at you for a couple of hours, and you might even do some of this practice, but then you go home and you're all by yourself again.
Yeah, and it's very frustrating because I want to. I mean, I really learned it this year, and I took an adult weight management course, and they kept also talking more and more about this, and they were really encouraging us to try to probably go to more of these courses that are offered. So I'm kind of looking into that. But it is hard because if your colleague isn't with you, or how you want to make sure you're doing this right and you don't use it daily, it's difficult.
Right. Yeah, I think it's really hard. I find it's hard for our graduate students, to grasp this, and they're getting it pretty much every day in the classes they're taking. And it's difficult for those of us, especially who've learned to try to put everything in one note, to be comfortable with breaking things down into smaller pieces, very discrete pieces. But I think if you practice, and even for yourself, even if you in the moment have to go back to something that's more comfortable for you, just so you can get it done and go on to your next patient, if you have time at the end of the day to be reflective, go back to those cases and practice, how would I have done this using a standardized terminology and a PES statement?
Yeah, I think I'll start doing that, like even one or two, and just practice it.
Yeah, and even if you don't put that back in your note, you at least have practiced for yourself.
Right.
Where you have plenty of time to look at the book and go through the categories, because some of these are going to be ones that, especially if you have a very a homogeneous group of people that you're taking care of, you're going to use some of the same ones over and over and over again. And some of the etiologies are going to be similar, and some of the signs and symptoms are going to be similar. So you're going to get really comfortable with using things over and over again. The problem is if you in a practice where the type of patient that you see is real different every time someone comes in,
right.
Then it takes a little bit longer because you're essentially trying to keep in your head everything on that diagnostic list. But I would encourage you, if you can, to just practice with the intake domain right now. Focus on that.
Yeah.
Because again, that's what we do. That's our thing. So and you can pretty much describe everything we do based on intake. So if you can't, and you've looked at all of that, you know that probably you've got something else going on. But if you can, practice with just using the intake domain, and try not to keep all that other stuff in your head at the beginning as you're trying to learn.
Okay, thank you. That was good advice.
Yeah,
right,
so I've been using. I was just going to give a couple of tips. So I've been doing, I changed my assessment now and started A-diming and PESing 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. And in the beginning, I did use a lot of the same ones repeatedly just because I felt safe with it. But I think it's important to keep in mind is that it's going to take years for you to, I'm still, like, sometimes I look back on what I wrote 2 months ago and I'm like, this was a ridiculous PES. I think the hardest part is to get at the real, true etiology. I feel like that's the hardest part of the PES statement is really understanding what the cause of something is for somebody. And it's not like, you know, you're going to ever get in trouble with billing or something if you're PES. It's your intervention. So you get to play with it. And I would recommend just starting, just on every single patient, write a PES statement, even if it's something you're just doing in a book, like a notebook, so that you can compare later to see, well, was this a good choice? Because like I said, when I look back on 3 years ago, I don't know how many times I just did food and nutrition-related knowledge deficit because I was just doing education, for example, and they had never heard about diabetic diet. And I just started there, and then I was able to, like, especially when I was doing renal, I did a lot more with the minerals and the carbs and the protein and really specific intake stuff. But I would just start knowing that, you know, it's just going to be a learning process for you. And I printed out the, I don't know what those pages are called, but you know how there's, like, the page in the manual with the diagnostic terms, and then there's one for mentioned. So I printed all those out. It's only like 5 pages, and I keep them in my clinical assessment notebook that I carry to clinics. And so I always review them and kind of compare, well, what am I really talking about? And then there's a matrix that will help you kind of decide if you choose this diagnosis, what are common etiologies of that?
Oh, that's helpful.
It helps you kind of identify. And that's like a 50-page matrix, but I also keep that in my clinical book. So you could always try that just to get yourself started.
Thank you. Yeah, I will. It's hard, like, if you know, because I don't have another colleague here, and it's just like, oh, sometimes you want to ask that person, is this kind of the way to do it? So I'm just going to be, you know, practice, and I know eventually it'll get better.
Or bring him to Envision. You could always just write down, like, a 1-paragraph case study and then the PES you chose, and then we could all talk about it.
Right, yeah, that would be good, too.
Yeah, we could do that at PNT. That would be a good use of our time.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Kirsten.
And then we'll be notified by email for the recorded webinars.
We typically don't send out an email.
Okay.
No, but it should be up within the next week.
Okay, great. And that's just on the website.
Yes, yeah, it's on the envisionnm.org website.
If you can see your screen now, I'll go there and we can look at where it is. So if you go to the videos right here under telehealth.
Oh, okay.
Click on that link, and then each one of the clinics is here.
Okay.
Okay, and you'll see the sessions that are recorded. Okay. Plus we have some other stuff on here. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great holiday season. I will see you all in January. We do not have a session scheduled on the 20th because that's the last day that the university is running its regular schedule, and we figured there'd be a lot of people getting ready to travel for the holiday. So we will see you in the new year. And if you have an opportunity, sign up for the practice sessions next week. It won't take very long, but I think it'll be helpful to know that you're going to see a different screen. And it gives us the possibility of actually seeing you. So I would encourage you, if you've got a webcam in your office, make sure that's active and works when you sign up for the practice session, because you'll actually be able to see us and we'll be able to see you. So that'll be really cool.
And if you need any assistance with that or any advice on that, feel free to give me a call or send me an email. This is Kevin Warling on the staff page of envisionnm.org. You can find my information. And I can probably walk you through it or get to the right IT person who can help you at your site.
Okay. Have a great weekend. If you are coming back to ComTC at noon, Kevin will actually be doing the presenting, and he will be talking about use of technology for managing overweight and obesity in youth. So that should be really cool, especially since everyone's going to get a gadget for Christmas. I know they are.
Thank you.
Thank you.